Chapter 19. New Trends of Hostility. The victory achieved by the Muslims at the Battle of Badr sent a shiver into the hearts of all those who did not wish Islam well. It is wrong to assume that the Quraysh in Mecca were the only enemy of Islam. The Prophet had his state in Medina, where an alliance and a bond of brotherhood was established between its Muslim inhabitants and the few hundreds who emigrated with the Prophet from Mecca. Newcomers to Islam were joining every day. Nevertheless, a large section of the population of Medina simply preferred to stick to idolatrous beliefs. It is extremely difficult to ascertain the relative strength of the Muslims and the non-believers in Medina. It is certain, however, that the Muslims had the upper hand and were the masters in the city. Several factors contributed to this state of affairs, the most important of which was that the Muslims were united under the leadership of the Prophet, whose care and compassion were never in short supply. Moreover, his undoubted wisdom was greatly enhanced by the guidance he received from God. The opposition, on the other hand, lacked any sort of wise leadership and was certainly far from united. Realizing that the victory in Badr could only add to the strength of the Muslims and enhance their reputation throughout Arabia, many of those Arabs in Medina who chose not to become Muslims felt that they could protect their interests only if they joined the new camp. This realization, however, was not based on any appreciation on their part of the truth of Islam. It was simply motivated by their instinct for self-preservation. They feared that the Prophet and his companions would follow the victory achieved at Badr with more resounding victories, which would make them undisputed masters in the whole of Arabia. If that eventuality would come to pass while they themselves remained non-believers, they would miss out, they thought, on their opportunity to be part of this mastery. Joining the ranks of the believers seemed to them a very attractive proposition because it would spare them any hostility on the part of the Muslims. If they continued to stay aside, leaving the tide of Islam to go its way while they kept to their old practices, they feared they might be reduced to total insignificance. But how could they be assimilated into the new setup when they did not believe in Islam and could not accept Muhammad, peace be upon him, as God's messenger? To them, that was a difficult question. From another point of view, who could tell that the victory achieved in Badr was not the result of the Muslims being able on that day to rise to the big occasion? Who could be sure that the same would happen again and again? What would happen when the Quraysh had recovered from their setback and marshaled forces to attack Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions? If the Quraysh were able to inflict a crushing defeat on the Muslims in the next battle, would that not signify the end of Islam? If that came to pass, these people thought they would have gained nothing from joining the Muslims now. Instead, they would have gained the hostility of their Jewish neighbors and the hostility of their co-religionists, the unbelievers in Mecca and elsewhere. Jumping on the bandwagon. This was the dilemma faced many a non-believer in Medina. They did not take long to discover their way out. They decided to take a hypocritical stand. They simply pretended to be Muslims, while deep in their hearts there was no shred of faith in Islam. God has described their attitude in the Quran. When they meet the believers, they claim, "We also are believers." But when they are alone with their devils, they declare to them, "We are truly on your side. We are simply mocking." 2:14. Their decision was to hold the stick in the middle. To all appearances, they became Muslims. They would pray and fast and speak as if they belonged to the Muslim community. Deep at heart, however, they remained non-believers. They simply had nothing in common with the Muslims. Their hearts were full of hatred towards the Prophet and his companions, and they longed for something to happen that would put an end to Islam altogether. What was worse was that these people were able to know many a secret of the Muslims and to pass these secrets on to other enemies of Islam. They would spare no effort in their attempts to cause the Muslims harm. The Muslims were at a loss to know how to deal with this group of people. They did not state their rejection of Islam openly so that they could be treated as enemies. Neither were they true believers with whom the Muslims could share all their cares and concerns. They were simply in between, neither here nor there. For this reason, God decrees their behavior in the Quran, condemns them in numerous verses, and threatens them with the most painful punishment in the hereafter. Surely, the hypocrites shall be in the lowest depth of the fire, and you will find none who could support them. 4:145. He has made it clear that he alone will decide their punishment, because he alone knows their true motives and their deceptive appearances. He knows what they say to each other in private, and he knows the lies behind which they hide their true nature. Indeed, they managed to put on such a highly deceptive appearance that the Prophet himself did not know much of the truth about them. Even this fact is stated in the Quran. Among the Bedouin who dwell around you, there are hypocrites, and among the people of Medina, there are such as have grown insolent in their hypocrisy. You do not always know them, but we do know them. We shall cause them to suffer doubly in this world, and then they will be given over to awesome suffering in the life to come. 9:101. These hypocrites were certainly the worst and most dangerous enemies of Islam. Their objective, which was always present in their minds, and for the achievement of which they worked very hard, was the elimination of Islam altogether and the Muslims generally. They seized every opportunity to cause the Muslims all the damage they could. They adopted several means and tactics for the achievement of their goal. They tried hard to demoralize the Muslims when they went to war and worked hard to bring about a split in their ranks. They belittled Muhammad's message, peace be upon him, so that Muslims would look at it with less respect. And they maintained secret contacts with other enemies of Islam inside and outside Medina in order to forge an alliance which would group all these forces in an all-out effort to exterminate Islam. The Prophet, however, was ordered by God to accept from them what they professed and leave them to God to judge them as he knew their reality. The Prophet, however, felt very sorry for them because they were aware of the teachings of Islam and could realize that it was a message from God. Nevertheless, they decided to reject it and continue with their erring ways and false beliefs. On several occasions, he would hint to them that he was aware of their hypocrisy. He did not take any measure to harm them, except for the fact that he described them as a group as insignificant cowards. But he did not publicly attach such a description to any one of them personally. Different Jewish attitudes. The hypocrites certainly played a significant role in the events that took place in Medina and elsewhere at the time of the Prophet. This will be discussed together with their schemes and tactics in the war against Islam later in this book. Another trend of hostility, which was to come into the open soon after the Battle of Badr, came from the Jews. It was mentioned earlier that there was a large concentration of Jews in and around Medina. According to their own statements, the Jews came to live in Medina because they knew it was the place to which the last of the prophets would emigrate and establish his state. They hoped that the last of the prophets would be one of them. They gathered in Medina in the hope that they would follow him and establish with him a new kingdom, similar to that of David and Solomon. The Prophet might have hoped that the Jews would follow him because theirs was a divine religion which emanated from the same source as Islam. Little did he think at the beginning that blind hatred of anything that did not emanate with the Israelites would determine the Jews' attitude towards Islam. In the early days of the Prophet's settlement in Medina, there were a few encouraging signs about the Jewish attitude, but the indications of a forthcoming hard struggle were much more numerous. A few examples of both types of indicator will give us a clear idea of Jewish attitudes to Islam in those early days. The first report concerns an old Jewish man who traveled from Syria to settle in Medina a few years before its people heard of Islam. This man, called Ibn al-Hayyaban, soon acquired a high reputation for his devotion and scholarship. His behavior was testimony to his keen sense of devotion. He gained great respect among Jews and Arabs alike. If rain was scarce, people asked him to pray for rain. He would refuse unless they were willing to make a sizable donation to the poor. He would then go outside the city with the people to pray God for rain. He would hardly have finished when clouds would appear and rain would be pouring down. He did this several times. He was soon taken ill, and it appeared that his illness was terminal. When he was certain of that, he spoke to his people, putting to them this question: "My Jewish people, what do you think was the reason for me to leave the land of fertility and fine produce in order to settle in this land of poverty and hunger?" They told him that he must have had a good reason. He said, "I have come here only to await the appearance of a prophet who is due to appear any time now. It is to this city that he will emigrate. I had hoped that I would see him and follow him. As I say, it is time for him to appear. Let no one beat you to follow him, my Jewish people. He will be given permission to shed blood and to enslave the women and children of his opponents. Let that not be a barrier which prevents you from following him. Ibn al-Hayyaban died soon afterwards. Several years later, when the Prophet had settled in Medina and when he besieged the Jewish tribe of Qurayza for their treachery, several young men of that Jewish tribe spoke out reminding their people of Ibn al-Hayyaban's prophecy and asserting that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the prophet he had mentioned. The elders of the tribe denied that he was the promised prophet. Those young men were certain of their ground and told their people that all descriptions of this prophet were met by Muhammad, peace be upon him. Therefore, they came out of the forts of Qurayza and declared their acceptance of Islam. By so doing, they protected their property and their families. Another encouraging sign was provided by Mukhairik, a Jewish rabbi of high renown and a man of vast wealth, which was mostly in date palms. He recognized the Prophet according to his description in the Jewish scriptures. However, he found it hard to abandon Judaism and follow Islam. He continued to hesitate for more than 2 years. When the Quraysh tried to attack Medina in the 3rd year of the Prophet's settlement there, and the attempt led to the Battle of Uhud, which shall be described in detail in the next chapter, Mukhairik sent to his people, "My Jewish people, you certainly know that supporting Muhammad, peace be upon him, is your bounden duty." They said it was the Sabbath and they could do nothing. He told them that they had no Sabbath. He picked up his armor and went to see the Prophet at Uhud. Before leaving, he made a will that should he die on that day, all his property should go to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to do with it whatever he liked. When the battle broke out, he fought hard until he was killed. The Prophet received Mukhairik's wealth, and it was from this money that the Prophet made most of his sadaqah or charitable donations. A test of honesty. An even more telling report is the one which concerns Abdullah ibn Salam, a highly prominent Jewish rabbi. This is his story. When I heard about God's messenger, peace be upon him, I recognized his description, name, and the time in which we were waiting his appearance. I did not disclose any of this information, but kept it to myself until God's messenger arrived in Medina. When he arrived at Quba and stayed with the clan of Amr ibn Auf, a man came to tell us of his arrival. I was at the top of a date tree doing some work, while my paternal aunt, Khalida bint al-Harith, was sitting underneath. When I heard the news of the arrival of God's messenger, peace be upon him, I glorified God. When my aunt heard me, she said, "Confound you! By God, had you heard of Moses himself coming, you could not say anything more." I told her, "Aunt, he is by God the brother of Moses, peace be upon him, and he follows Moses' faith, and he has been sent with the same message as that of Moses, peace be upon him." She said, "Nephew, is he the prophet whom we have been told would be sent with the approach of the hour?" The term "the hour" refers to the end of life and the arrival of the day of judgment. I told her that he was. She said, "That is it then." I then went to meet God's messenger, peace be upon him, and adopted Islam. I have turned to my family and told them to do likewise, and they also adopted Islam. At first, I kept my adoption of Islam a secret. I then went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and said to him, "Messenger of God, the Jews are always ready to follow falsehood. I would like you to put me in one of your rooms and ask them about me when they are unaware of my presence, so that they can tell you what position I have among them before they come to know of my adoption of Islam. Should they know it initially, they would abuse me and speak ill of me." The Prophet allowed me to go into one of his rooms. They came to him and spoke to him, putting some questions. He then asked them, "How do you view Al-Hussein ibn Salam, the man's real name?" They answered, "He is our master, and his father was also our master. He is a rabbi of great scholarship." When they had said that, I came out and said to them, "My Jewish people, fear God and accept what Muhammad, peace be upon him, tells you. By God, you certainly know that he is God's messenger, who is mentioned by name and qualities in your Torah. I, for my part, bear witness that he is God's messenger, and I believe in him and know him to be a prophet." They said, "You are telling lies," and started to abuse me. I turned to the Prophet and said, Messenger of God, have I not told you that they follow falsehood, and they are treacherous people who do not hesitate to lie? I declare that I and my household follow the religion of Islam. My paternal aunt, Khalda bint al-Harith, also adopted Islam and became a good Muslim. A confrontational attitude. This last report is of a rabbi who was honest with himself. When he ascertained that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the prophet God had promised to send to mankind, he could not oppose him. He had to act on the basis of his knowledge, and he accepted Islam. However, the majority of the Jews were not ready to do likewise. They preferred to oppose the prophet, knowing that by doing so, they would incur God's wrath. There are similar incidents which confirm this hostile attitude. The first is reported by Safiya bint Huyay, who was later to be married to the prophet. Her father was a highly prominent Jewish rabbi, well versed in the Jewish scriptures. She reports, I was my father's favorite child, and I was also the favorite of my uncle, Abu Yasir. They would never see me with the child of either of them without picking me up in preference to the other child. When God's messenger arrived in Medina and stayed at Quba, my father, Huyay ibn Akhtab, and my uncle, Abu Yasir, went to see him before sunrise. They did not return home until sunset. They were so tired when they came back that they could have dropped as they walked. My face was beaming with a smile as I went towards them. Neither, however, took any notice of me, because they were obviously very depressed. I heard my uncle Abu Yasir say to my father Huyay, Is it truly he? My father answered, Yes, indeed. By God, it is he. My uncle said, Do you recognize him perfectly? My father answered him in the affirmative. Then my uncle asked, What are you going to do? My father answered, By God, I will be his enemy as long as I live. Indeed, these last two examples illustrate a conscious decision by the Jews to oppose the prophet, knowing that he was God's messenger and the last prophet who would be sent to mankind. This is indeed the worst type of opposition, because it is adopted in spite of a clear recognition that such opposition flies in the face of the truth. Hence, its proponents will always be hardened by this knowledge, knowing that any weakening in their opposition would expose their falsehood and would show them to be untrue to their own faith. Indeed, Huyay ibn Akhtab was to give credence to his statement and later spared no effort in trying to suppress the voice of Islam. Nevertheless, the Prophet did not despair of calling on the Jews to be honest to themselves and to accept Islam. For example, he wrote a letter addressed to the Jews of Khaybar in the north of Arabia, reminding them of God's grace and confirming that it was their duty to follow him. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Beneficent. From Muhammad, peace be upon him, God's messenger, Moses' colleague and brother, who confirms the message conveyed by Moses, peace be upon him. God has said to you, people of the Torah, what you surely find in your scriptures, Muhammad is God's messenger, peace be upon him, and those who are with him are firm and unyielding towards all disbelievers, yet full of mercy towards one another. You see them bowing down, prostrating themselves in prayer, seeking favor with God and his goodly acceptance. Their marks are on their faces, traced by prostration. This is the example given of them in the Torah as well as in the Gospel. They are like a seed that brings forth its shoot, and then he strengthens it, so that it grows stout, and in the end stands firm upon its stem, delighting the sowers, so that through them he might confound the unbelievers. God has promised those of them who attain to faith and do righteous deeds his forgiveness and supreme reward. I appeal to you by God, and by what has been revealed to you, and by what God has fed your predecessors of manna and quails, and I appeal to you by him who parted the sea for your predecessors to save them from Pharaoh and his might, to tell me, do you find it in your scriptures which have been revealed to you that you must believe in Muhammad, peace be upon him? If you do not find this in your scriptures, then let it be so. The right way has now become distinct from the way of error. I therefore call on you to believe in God and his messenger. No such appeal could be of much avail with people who had determined to fight the truth of Islam tooth and nail. Indeed, they stopped at nothing to undermine the new faith. They would have done anything to bring back hostility between the tribes of the Aus and the Khazraj. Stirring up old hostility. Shas ibn Qais was an old Jew with unparalleled hatred for Islam. One day, he passed a group of the Prophet's companions, including members of both tribes. He was appalled to see them with one another. He recognized that this friendship was brought about only by Islam. He thought that with such unity, the position of the Jews in Medina was threatened. He called the young Jewish man who was sitting with them and told him that when he went to rejoin them, he should remind them of the Battle of Buat and other battles that took place between the two tribes, and that he should recite some of the poetry composed on those occasions in which each tribe extolled its fighters and abused its opponents. The young man did as Shah said. That was sufficient to make some of the Prophet's companions speak highly of those days, and this led to ill feeling being stirred up again between them. This went on for some time, and anger replaced their friendliness. Some suggested that they could resume fighting that very day to prove who was superior. In no time, the Prophet learnt of this. He came to them as fast as he could, accompanied by some of the Muhajirin. He appealed to their sense of faith. Muslims, fear God. Are you to resume the enmity of ignorance when I am still among you, after God has guided you to believe in Islam and submit to Him? Do you forget God's blessing, as He has saved you from ignorance and disbelief and planted love and friendliness in your hearts instead of hostility? They immediately recognized that they had allowed themselves to be deluded by their enemies. They were in tears and hugged one another. They went with the Prophet praying God to forgive them. All this goes to show that the Jews in Medina were fierce enemies of Islam, waiting for every chance to deal a devastating blow to Muslims. Despite the fact that the Prophet made a treaty with the Jews when he first came to Medina, which stipulated that the Jews would support the Muslims in any fight against any enemy who threatened the Muslims in Medina, it was soon to become clear that the Jews had no intention of putting that provision into effect. Indeed, their hatred of Islam, which had no cause except the fact that the Prophet himself was not Jewish, became self-evident. So much so that when they realized that the Muslims had achieved a resounding victory at Badr, they felt very sorry for the unbelievers and felt insecure in Medina. One of their leaders, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, commented on the Prophet's victory over the nobility of Arabia. Those are the most noble among the Arabs, the true kings. If Muhammad, peace be upon him, has dealt them such a heavy blow, death is certainly preferable to life. Hence, the Jews gave every indication that they considered their peace treaty with the Prophet broken. Their poets started to ridicule the Muslims and belittle their victory. Unashamedly, they also spoke ill of the Prophet and started a barrage of ridicule against him. Trying for a showdown. There were several Jewish tribes in and around Medina. The tribe of Qaynuqa was renowned for its bravery amongst all Jews. They were also closest to the Arabs in their quarters. It was perhaps this proximity that led the Jewish tribe of Qaynuqa to show more hostility to the Muslims than the rest of the Jews. The atmosphere between the Muslims and the Jews became very tense. Any provocation would surely be enough to start a war between the two parties. Such a provocation was soon to come. A Muslim woman went to the Qaynuqa market and sat in front of a jeweler's shop. In order to have a laugh at her, a Jew came from behind her and took the lower edge of her dress and stuck it to her shoulders. But she was totally unaware and felt nothing of what was being done to her. When she stood up, the lower half of her body was visible, and all the Jews around her laughed. She cried for help, and a Muslim man nearby attacked the Jew who perpetrated this and killed him. Several men then attacked the Muslim and killed him. There was much chaos and confusion. Both Jews and Muslims were calling for help, and people started gathering. The situation would surely have led to a massacre. The Prophet, however, was informed, and he quickly came over and tried to calm everybody down. The Prophet called the notables in the Qaynuqa tribe and spoke to them, warning them against any breach of their treaty. You had better guard against a calamity like that which befell the Quraysh. You will be well advised to adopt Islam, because you know that I am a messenger from God. You find this in your own book, and it is contained in God's promise to you. Their hatred, however, had become very strong, and they would not listen. Their answer was far from conciliatory. Muhammad, peace be upon him, do you think that we are an easy prey? Do not let euphoria overtake you. You simply met some people who had no knowledge of war and its tactics, which enabled you to score an easy victory. If we were to fight you, you would certainly know that we are the true fighters." Thus, the situation had undergone a total change. The Jewish tribe of Kenuka moved over to the enemy camp after they had been friends with the Muslims. Their hostility was not passive. They themselves were calling for a fight with everything they did or said. The Muslims then had to face the situation with appropriate means and with the firmness it called for. There was certainly no chance that the Muslims would feel easy about probable treachery by the Kenuka Jews when the state of war still existed between the Muslims and the Quraysh. The Prophet received the following instruction from God: "If you have reason to fear treachery from people with whom you have made a covenant, cast it back at them in an equitable manner. For indeed, God does not love the treacherous." 8:58. It was clear that the Kenuka Jews had embarked on treachery, broken their pledges and promises, and started a provocation campaign which might lead to a full-scale war. Overcoming the new threat. One must remember here that their district in Medina was very close to the Muslim areas, which meant that there was constant contact between the two. The Jews certainly knew a great deal about the Muslims and were aware of many of their secrets. All this called for decisive action on the part of the Prophet in order to put an end to this threat. This is exactly what the Prophet did. He declared to them that the treaty between the two parties no longer had any value. He also warned them that he considered himself at war with them. They, on their part, went into their fortifications, while the Muslims put them under siege. The siege continued for 15 days, during which the Kenuka Jews received no help whatsoever from any quarter. It is interesting to note that the two other main Jewish tribes, namely Al-Nadir and Qurayza, who both lived on the outskirts of Medina, did not attempt to help the Kenuka Jews in their confrontation with the Prophet. This in itself could be taken as evidence of the treachery of the Kenuka Jews. The other Jews were no less hostile to Islam than the Kenuka tribe, although they did not show it at the time. If the case of treachery was not clear-cut, the other Jews would at least have mediated between the Prophet and their cousins. The fact that these tribes remain neutral suggests that the Kenuka Jews would have lost their case even if it had been put to a Jewish jury. It was mentioned earlier that there were alliances between the Jews and the Arabs in Medina. Every Jewish tribe had alliances with several clans of the Arab tribes. This was natural in a tribal society like that of Arabia and a multinational community like that of Medina. Obviously, the Kenuka Jews hoped that their former allies would come to their aid. The two leaders who had firm alliances with the Kenuka Jews were Ubadah ibn al-Samit and Abdullah ibn Ubay. Ubadah was now a good Muslim. He went to the Prophet, having realized that his allies were guilty of treachery, and said to him, "Messenger of God, my only loyalty is to God, His Messenger, and the believers. I renounce the alliance with these unbelievers, and I will give them no support whatsoever." Abdullah's case was totally different. He simply professed to be a Muslim, while his actions did not give credence to his claim. Over the following years, he would emerge as the leader of the hypocrites. On this occasion, he felt that if the Kenuka Jews, his allies, were to suffer a heavy defeat, his strength in Medina would be completely eroded. He therefore went to the Prophet and said to him, "Be good to my allies." The Prophet made no reply, and Abdullah harshly repeated what he had said. The Prophet simply turned away from him. Abdullah then put his hand inside the Prophet's armor, and the Prophet asked him to let him go. Abdullah did not listen. The Prophet became angry and said, "Let me go." Abdullah then said, "I will not let you go until you are good to my allies. There are 700 fighters who protected me against all my enemies, and you come to finish them off in one day? I am a man who fears the turns of fortune." The Prophet then said to him, "They are yours." When the Kenuka Jews felt that the siege was biting and that they would receive no support from the other Jews or from their allies, they realized that their case was hopeless. They were overtaken by fear and decided to ask the Prophet to let them leave Medina. He accepted their offer to leave and let them go with their women and children, provided they left behind their property and their arms. He appointed their former ally, Ubadah ibn al-Samit, to supervise their departure, which was a very good gesture from the Prophet, because Ubadah was sure to be kind to them. Thus, the first Jewish tribe left Medina. A truly moderate attitude. To all appearances, the Prophet took a relatively mild attitude towards the hypocrites and the Jews. Although Abdullah ibn Ubay behaved so insolently and made the Prophet angry, the Prophet did not let his anger dictate his actions. He allowed Abdullah to keep his alliance with the Kenuka Jews and allowed them to leave Medina in peace with their women and children. This moderate attitude made little impression on Abdullah, who remained hostile to Islam despite his declaration that he was a Muslim. On several occasions, he adopted attitudes which were highly detrimental to the cause of Islam. Some historians may suggest that had the Prophet adopted a strong attitude towards him right from the beginning, he was bound to think twice before he took another hostile position. This argument does not take into consideration the fact that Abdullah had a large following in Medina amongst the Arabs who viewed Islam with suspicion and hatred. Abdullah was indeed a man of strong influence. Before the Prophet's emigration to Medina, preparations were underway to crown him as king of Medina. It was only owing to the rise of Islam in Medina that he was deprived of that position. He, however, continued to wield great influence among all those who did not readily accept Islam. Had the Prophet taken him to task on this first occasion of insolence, many of the Arabs who considered him as leader would have been quick to defend him. There might have been a situation of polarization which could have led to a confrontation between the Muslim Arabs and the non-Muslim Arabs in Medina. That would have meant civil war. Only the Jews and the Quraysh would have benefited from that situation. The Kenuka Jews would have felt much stronger and together with Abdullah ibn Ubay and his followers would have tried to deal a crushing blow to the Prophet and his companions. Yet the fact that the Prophet decided to take a conciliatory attitude towards Abdullah did not mean that he felt himself to be weak. Indeed, it is the strong who can afford to take such an attitude. The Prophet was sure to win any confrontation with the hypocrites in Medina or with their Jewish allies. He had an army composed of fighters who cared nothing for life when it came to rendering sacrifice for the cause of Islam. Death in battle meant martyrdom, which ensured the highest position in heaven in the life to come. Such an army was more than a match for any force the enemies of Islam could muster. But it is important sometimes to win the peace than to win the war. The Prophet's attitude to Abdullah was one which could win hearts and peace. Moreover, the Prophet's prime objective was to widen the base of Islam and to propagate it far and wide. He considered that if he let a confrontation develop between his followers and the Arabs of Medina, this would adversely affect the cause of Islam outside the city. Other Arabian tribes would have seen it as a purely internal feud between two groups of Muslims. They had no way of knowing that Abdullah and whoever chose to follow him were not truly Muslims. To all appearances, they were. Reports would go far and wide that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was killing some of his own followers. That was bound to make other tribes and other nations take an extremely mistaken view of Islam and its message. Surely, the harm that such an attitude could cause would outweigh the benefit that might have accrued from adopting a strong attitude towards the hypocrites. The confrontation with the Jews, on the other hand, was inevitable. Things had not gone smoothly between them and the Muslims over the 18 months that had passed since the Prophet's emigration to Medina. It was clear that the Jews encouraged the hypocrites to oppose Islam and tried to sow the seeds of discord between the two main groups of Muslims, the Muhajirin, who emigrated from Mecca, and the Ansar, who originally lived in Medina. They even tried to persuade the Prophet to leave Medina and go to Jerusalem. They also tried to embarrass him with questions concerning all aspects of faith and religion, hoping that such questions would make some of his followers reconsider their attitude towards Islam. The Prophet, however, stood firm against all these attempts. As the Quran was in the process of revelation, it dealt with all their queries and gave the Muslims the final word about all the aspects of faith and religion, leaving no room for suspicion as to which of the two religions was the one acceptable to God. A fundamental challenge. All this, however, led to an escalation of the tension between the two camps. The Kenuka Jews, living in the midst of the Muslims, were the first of the Jewish tribes to attempt to confront them. It is difficult to see what made the Kenuka Jews feel that they could stand up to the might of the Muslims, especially when the Muslims had just scored a resounding victory against the Quraysh. Their morale was bound to be sky high. They were sure of God's help and that He alone had granted them victory at Badr. They realized that if they were true in their submission to God, He would not let them down in any confrontation. The Qainuqa Jews had probably thought that unless the Muslims were made to suffer a blow or a defeat, they would only get stronger and would soon become unstoppable. They might have argued that an encounter with the Muslims at that particular moment was their best chance to achieve victory. Some non-Muslim historians believe that it was possible for the Prophet to achieve a modus vivendi with the Jews in Medina. After all, they argue, Islam and Judaism are two monotheistic religions. They have a great deal in common. A little flexibility from both sides would have been enough to ensure that a state of cooperation existed between them, which would have enabled them to face the pagan Arabs and put an end to idolatry. These historians forget that the Prophet had made a sincere attempt to achieve such a state of peaceful coexistence and cooperation with the Jews. The treaty he signed with them could have ensured peaceful coexistence between the two sides for a long time to come, provided that goodwill existed on both sides. The Qainuqa Jews, however, showed no sign of goodwill. As already mentioned, they were very sorry when they learned that the idolaters of the Quraysh had suffered a heavy defeat at the hands of the Muslims. One Jewish leader, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, went to Mecca to offer his condolences to the Quraysh leaders and wept for their dead. There was indeed one significant factor which made peace between the Jews and the Muslims very difficult to achieve. This factor had its roots in the very nature of the two religions. Islam adopts a universal outlook. It opens its arms to every human being to adopt it. All Muslims, regardless of their ethnic origin, color, race, or nation, are absolutely equal. All people are invited to adopt Islam, and all are treated absolutely equally once they become Muslims. It was a great achievement of Islam in the tribal society of Arabia, based on class and race, that a man like Umar, who before the advent of Islam was considered among the nobility and become after Islam the second most important follower of the Prophet, should refer to Bilal, a former slave, as our master. In the early days of Islam in Mecca, Bilal, as discussed earlier, was subjected to severe torture by his master, who tried to force him to renounce Islam. To save Bilal, Abu Bakr, the Prophet's companion, bought him and set him free. Referring to this incident, Umar said, "Abu Bakr was our master, and he set our master free." It is this attitude of open arms to welcome all men or women, humble or noble, free or slave, white or black, to the fold of Islam, considering them all as equals, which distinguishes this great religion. Islam is indeed a religion of all mankind. It is this openness and this universality which makes it so different from Judaism. The Jews consider themselves God's chosen people. As such, they believe themselves to be above the rest of mankind. Their sense of the superiority of their race was the prime cause of their hostility to Islam. They knew that a prophet was bound to come. Indeed, their choice of Medina as a place for their settlement was motivated by the fact that they knew from their scriptures that Medina was the place to which the last of the prophets would emigrate. They went there in order to receive him and follow him. But when they realized that the last of the prophets was not an Israelite, but an Arab, an Ishmaelite, their narrow sense of racism blinded them into harboring unwavering hatred towards Islam and cut for them a course of unnecessary resistance. This was the true reason why the Qainuqa Jews wanted to deal a quick blow to Islam and put an end to it. They sensed that, brave and strong as they were, they could achieve their purpose at that particular time. Perhaps they banked on support from the hypocrites on the one hand and their fellow Jews on the other. That would have meant that they would have the numerical strength which was bound to bring them victory. However, they reckoned without the power and the wisdom of God, who was guiding his prophet to victory over all his enemies. The case of a prominent Jew. A prominent personality of the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, was so distressed at the defeat of the Quraysh at Badr that he felt and said that death was preferable to life since the Quraysh leaders were killed. Shortly after the Muslims' victory at Badr, Ka'b went to Mecca to offer his condolences to the pagan Arabs there and to encourage them to look forward to another encounter when they could avenge themselves on Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. While in Mecca, he wrote poems condemning the Muslims and the Prophet in particular, and openly declaring his sympathy with the idolaters of the Quraysh. After a long stay in Mecca, during which he did his utmost to persuade the Quraysh to prepare for an assault on the Muslims, he came back to Medina, where he started to hit the Muslims below the belt, as it were. He wrote obscene love poems mentioning Muslim women. This was extremely offensive to the Muslims, who valued their honor very highly. It was also meant to cause domestic problems in the homes of some of the Muslims. Thus, the man was openly an enemy who did not disguise his hostility to the Prophet and to the Muslims in general. Reviewing the case of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, the Prophet felt that he must be stopped. He therefore said to some of his companions, "Who will rid us of Ibn al-Ashraf, for he has declared his hostility to us openly?" A man from the Ansar called Muhammad ibn Masalma said, "I volunteer for that. I will kill him." This man requested and was granted permission from the Prophet to pretend to Ka'b that he and his friends were against the Prophet and against Islam. It is important to note here that the Prophet did not hesitate to grant them such a permission because he realized that if they succeeded in deluding Ka'b into thinking them hostile to the Prophet, they would be able to accomplish their mission much more easily and without loss. A group of the Ansar, including Muhammad ibn Masalma and Silkan ibn Salama, went to Ka'b. Silkan was Ka'b's brother by virtue of their both being breastfed by the same woman. There was therefore an element of trust between them. For this reason, Silkan was the first to go to Ka'b. They chatted together for a while, and Silkan and Ka'b read some of their poetry to each other in a happy social evening. After a while, Silkan said that he had come for a certain purpose, but he wanted Ka'b first to promise that he would keep his secret. When Ka'b gave him that promise, Silkan said, "The arrival of this man, the Prophet, and his stay among us has been a real disaster for us. All the Arabs are now against us, and they have joined forces in their hostility to us. We are now virtually besieged. Our children are suffering. We are all enduring real hardship, and we cannot really provide well for our children." Ka'b answered, "I am Ibn al-Ashraf. I did tell you repeatedly that you would be facing this situation." Silkan then said, "I have come to you to buy food from you, and we will pledge with you something which could secure our debt." Ka'b asked whether they were prepared to pledge their women with him. Silkan pointed out that he was the playboy of Medina, and it was impossible for them to trust him with their women. He then proposed that they should give him their children as a pledge. Silkan said, "You want to shame us among the Arabs? I am telling you, I have friends who share my opinion. I would like you to meet them and sell them what they need. We will all be making a good deal. We will give you enough of our armor to secure for you the price of the food you would be selling us." Silkan's aim was that Ibn al-Ashraf would not be surprised or suspicious at their bringing their armor with them. Ka'b said, "Your armor would be good security." Silkan went back to his companions and told them to get ready. They all met at the Prophet's place. Then they set out, and the Prophet walked with them part of the way. Before they left him, he blessed their mission and prayed God to help them. When they arrived at Ka'b's fort, Silkan shouted for him to come down. Apparently, Ka'b was newly married, but he jumped out of bed and answered. His wife, standing aside, said to him, "You are a man at war, and people at war do not go out of their forts at this time of night." Ka'b said, "This is Silkan, Abu Nela. Had he found me asleep, he would not have woken me up." She rejoined, "I can hear treachery in his voice." Ka'b said, "The man," meaning himself, "would answer even if he is called in order to be stabbed." He went down to them, and they chatted for a while before they proposed that he should join them for a walk down to Shib al-Ajuz, a place at the outskirts of Medina, where they would spend a few hours together. He agreed, and they walked together. The killing of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf. A little while later, Silkan put his hand on Ka'b's hair and then smelt his hand and said, "I have never smelled such a nice perfume." Walking on for a little longer, he repeated the gesture and then once again, so that Ka'b would not suspect anything. When they had walked for quite a while, Silkan suddenly held Ka'b by his head and shouted to his friends, "Kill the enemy of God!" They hit him with their swords, but he apparently had his armor on, and their swords did not harm him. Ka'b sent up such a loud cry that all the Jewish forts and castles around them were lit up, and there was no more time to waste. Muhammad ibn Masalma, however, had a knife. He stabbed Ka'b in the lower part of his abdomen and pulled the knife down. Ka'b fell. When they had made sure that Ka'b could not live, they started to run, but they realized that one of them, Al-Harith ibn Aus, was wounded and could not move as quickly as they did. They waited for him. When they reached a safe area, and when he arrived, they carried him and went straight to meet the Prophet. It was late into the night when they arrived, and the Prophet was at his prayer. When he finished, he went out to see them, and they told him of the success of their mission. He wiped Al-Harith's wound with his saliva, and it cleared up. They then went to their homes and stayed till the morning. The incident struck fear into the hearts of the Jews, who realized that the Muslims would tolerate hostility from no one. Many Orientalists have denounced the killing of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf as political assassination. Those among them who are hostile to Islam find in it material for denouncing Islam and the Prophet himself. The moderates, however, say that it left a stigma in the otherwise bright history of the Prophet. The incident, however, must be viewed in its proper perspective. All historical reports agree that when the Prophet arrived in Medina, he entered into a treaty with the Jews that they and the Muslims would live together in peace, with neither party interfering in the affairs or religion of the other. The treaty also stipulated that the Jews would never give any support to any enemy who attacked Yathrib or fought its people. The treaty also contained the following provisions. He who wrongs another brings retribution only on himself and his household. The parties to this agreement will support one another against any third party who wages a war against its signatories. They will give each other mutual advice and approve only good deeds to the exclusion of bad ones. Support shall be given to the oppressed. No protection shall be given by any party to the Quraysh or to any of its supporters. They shall come to each other's support against whoever attacks Yathrib. This treaty shall not give any immunity to any transgressor or any perpetrator of wrongs. He who leaves Medina is secure, and he who stays is secure, except for those who transgress. It is clear that the treaty could have provided for peaceful coexistence between the Muslims and the Jews. Its provisions were very clear and far-reaching. If each party had fulfilled its obligations under this treaty, the Muslims and the Jews could have lived peacefully, without any small incident to disturb that peace. One should note here that the treaty provided for mutual support against all enemies. But it mentioned the Quraysh in particular because the Quraysh were the immediate enemy of the Muslims. It also declared that any individual who transgressed would bear the responsibility for his transgression. It is difficult to see any reason for Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf's support for the Quraysh and the feelings of hostility which he showed towards the Muslims when he realized that they had scored a resounding victory against the unbelievers. Indeed, he should have been delighted at the victory of the Muslims, for it was a victory of his neighbors and allies who followed a monotheistic religion like his own. One could ask and wonder, why did Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf go to the Quraysh, the most hardened enemy of Islam, to weep for its dead and to encourage its leaders to launch a fresh campaign to avenge themselves against the Muslims? Authentic report suggests that he stayed in Mecca until he was certain that an irreversible decision to attack the Muslims had been taken. Some reports even say that he entered into an alliance with the Quraysh to fight the Muslims alongside them. Besides, why did he write those obscene poems about Muslim women when he knew that nothing could be more offensive to the Muslims? Al-Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf's actions had engaged him in a war against the Muslims. It was he who decided to take that attitude. Even his wife tried to persuade him not to answer the call, pleading what she knew to be a fact, that he was an enemy in active warfare against the Muslims. As an enemy, he deserved to be killed. The fact that the Muslims adopted a method to achieve that end which did not cause any bloodshed between the Muslims and the Jews, apart from killing Ka'b, was a credit to them. If they had made false pretenses to him, these were made for a good purpose, to cause as little bloodshed as possible. A Jewish delegation came to the Prophet to protest against the killing of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf. The Prophet explained that Ka'b, unlike them, was involved in active hostility against the Muslims. He said, had he stayed here in peace like others who shared his opinion, he would not have been assassinated. The delegation accepted that Ka'b had chosen to be an active enemy and to support the camp hostile to Islam, and as such had made himself liable to be killed. An attempt at revenge. It is not in the nature of things that a major power in any region will accept a serious setback easily, without doing something to restore its pride. The pressures, both internal and external, in such cases are enormous. Everybody clamors for some sort of revenge, especially if the enemy which has inflicted the setback is, by normal standards, weaker than the side suffering it. This is exactly the situation that prevailed in Arabia after the defeat of the Quraysh at Badr. Although the Arabian tribes enjoyed full independence, with each of them conducting its own affairs, making its own alliances, and fighting its own wars, the Quraysh was without question the major tribe to which all other tribes deferred for leadership and guidance. The idea of revenge was therefore present in everybody's mind in Mecca, where the Quraysh resided, although nothing definite was proposed or considered. The nature of Arabian society at the time made the idea of revenge not merely desirable, but dearly cherished. It was a society where tribal wars broke out every other day, and revenge for a defeat, or indeed for one person's death, came very high on any tribe's list of priorities. Hence, everyone in Arabia felt that the Quraysh must do something to wipe out its humiliating defeat at Badr. But the Quraysh were in a state of shock. They were stunned by the defeat. After the death of many elders, there was no one to fill the vacuum of leadership. The Quraysh wept for their dead for a whole month. They then stopped, not because the wounds had healed or the sorrows were any less felt, but because someone suggested that the Prophet and his companions would be glad to see them weep. Other appearances of mourning were, however, kept. Everybody in the Quraysh wore mourning dress. Women cut their hair very short and left their husbands' beds, while men, despondent and unkempt, went about their business wearing an expression of gloom. Something had to happen to bring the Quraysh back to life. The tragedy was felt most strongly by Abu Sufyan and his wife, Hind bint Utbah ibn Rabi'a. At Badr, Hind lost her father, her brother, and her uncle, while another brother was in the Muslims' camp. Abu Sufyan was the leader of the caravan which the Prophet and the Muslims attempted to intercept. The attempt was the immediate cause of the Battle of Badr. He now sought the position of leader of the Quraysh. He saw that the time was ripe for him after the death of so many of the Quraysh's leaders. Hind was the first woman in the Quraysh to banish herself from her husband's bed. She vowed that she would wear no perfume until she had taken revenge. Her husband, on the other hand, vowed that he would not have a bath until he had exacted some revenge to restore the Quraysh's pride. Nearly 2.5 months after the Battle of Badr, Abu Sufyan mobilized a force of 200 horsemen and went towards Medina. They went first to the quarters of the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir. They called on Huway ibn Akhtab to get some information about the Prophet and his companions. But Huway refused to receive them. Their second choice was Salam ibn Mishkam, who received them well, entertained them, and told them everything he knew about the Prophet and the Muslims. Before dawn of the following day, Abu Sufyan and his men went to a place called Uraid, nearly 3 miles out of Medina, where they killed 2 men of the Ansar and burnt down several houses. Abu Sufyan felt that that was enough to honor his vows, so he left quickly with his men. When the Prophet heard of this incident, he called on his companions to pursue the raiders. He went out at the head of a force of 200 men of the Muhajirin and the Ansar in pursuit of Abu Sufyan and his men. When the latter realized that they were being followed, they started to drop their supplies of food to give themselves a better chance of escape. Most of the provisions they carried with them were of a foodstuff called savik, which was made of cereals and could keep for a long time. The raiders were a long way ahead of their Muslim pursuers, and they managed to escape. The Muslims, however, were happy to take the provisions thrown away by the Qurayshis, which were indeed plentiful. This is the reason why this pursuit in the desert was called the Savik Expedition. Efficient economic siege. Nothing much was achieved by this raid from the Quraysh's point of view. Preparations were therefore started for a major clash, although no definite plans were yet made. However, the need to restore the pride of the Quraysh was coupled with its need to secure its trade routes to Syria, which had come under constant threat from the Muslims in Medina. Their alternatives were indeed very limited, as indicated by Safwan ibn Umayyah, who said, "Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions have ruined our trade, while we do not know what measures to take against them. They are constantly threatening the coastal area, while its inhabitants are either at peace or in alliance with them. Where shall we live, and where shall we stay? If we stay here in our hometown, we will be forced to eat from our capital, which will soon be consumed. We depend for our lives on trade with Syria in the summer and with Yemen and Abyssinia in winter." Al-Aswad ibn al-Muttalib advised him to avoid the coastal route and to take the route leading to Iraq through Najd, for that was an area not frequented by Muhammad's followers, peace be upon him. He also advised Safwan to employ Furat ibn Hayyan as a guide. Thus, a caravan was equipped with all the normal exports of the Quraysh, and Safwan went at its head towards Iraq. The Prophet, however, had his informers looking in all directions. He soon learnt of the caravan and its route. He sent a force of 100 men of the Muhajirin and the Ansar, led by Zayd ibn Haritha, to intercept the caravan. They came into contact with it at a spring called Qarada in Najd. When Zayd and his men suddenly surrounded the caravan, all its men fled with the exception of the guide, who was taken prisoner and was soon to embrace Islam. The Muslims took possession of the caravan, which was worth 100,000 dirhams, a considerable amount by the standards of the time. The Prophet distributed the booty among his companions. Thus, the economic siege imposed by the Prophet and his companions on the Quraysh was now biting hard. There was no chance that the Quraysh could tolerate that for long. It was no longer just a matter of wounded pride. As far as the Quraysh were concerned, the situation was a matter of life and death. If it was to submit to the ascendancy of the Muslims, it was bound to lose all its prestige and forfeit its cause altogether. Hence, preparations for a new encounter were given a boost. A decision was unanimously taken by the Quraysh that the caravan led by Abu Sufyan, which had escaped interception by the Muslims, would be utilized in full for the preparations for the new battle. Yet, it was several months before the Quraysh could raise a well-equipped army to attack the Muslims. In the meantime, several clashes took place between the Muslims and some of the Arab tribes who lived near Medina. The Prophet adopted the tactic of surprise. Every time he learnt that a tribe or a group of tribes was preparing to attack the Muslims, he would take them by surprise with a preemptive strike against them. Historians give different reasons for these skirmishes. Some suggest that these tribes were in alliance with the Quraysh, while others suggest that they depended for a large portion of their revenue on the Quraysh's usage of the trade route from Mecca to Syria, passing through their areas. When the economic siege imposed by the Muslims on the Quraysh put a virtual end to the Quraysh's usage of that route, the siege hit those tribes as well. Whatever the reason, those clashes were only minor ones and could not affect the Muslims in any major way. Nor could these skirmishes divert the Muslims from concentrating on being ready for any attack which might be launched by their main enemy, the Quraysh.